So if we think about like our last video, right? We focused more about where we allocate police and, what can we, so rather than just putting them randomly, what happens if, we focus them on areas of greatest need? In this case, the areas that produce a lot of crime, right? So that last kind of thing can be thought, if one thing is like, where we put police. Right. So this is under this, right? It's an allocation problem. So in this other case, then, right? While that's useful and we can understand like where we want to put them, we also have like a different question, right? Because again, if we are thinking about this from a scarcity standpoint, is there any way how else can I maximize my limited resources, my utility? So in this case, then I'm not necessarily focused on like where I'm placing officers as much, right? We assume that that is good. We know that is a better, more efficient way of allocating officers, right? Is on areas based off of greatest need. And so what we end up wanting to do then, right, is like, what else can we do beyond placement? And at this point, what we end up focusing on, right, is not where do we put people, right? Like what police do, where they're allocated. Because, it's one thing to have officers, distributed to certain areas, right? You also know that placement alone, right? There's only like maybe like 15 minutes at any kind of place where that kind of like we can send officers, right? And we can just send them, but if they're not really doing anything right, we can maybe like have them do something with our time, right? So this is another way to get more value, right? So as we're trying to generate, our value from our allocation. So one way to think about this, right, is that if we're thinking about we're being patrolled certain areas, right, never mind all the other trade-offs that we discussed before, right? There's one way we can think about this, right? Is if we think about this as a broken windows or what is in some way, right, other ways called disorder policing. So in this particular case, what ends up happening, right, is that we are making a decision, right? And when we focus on disorder, right, we're focusing on areas where maybe there is physical disorder. So if we think about this, it's going to be stuff like graffiti. This is going to be stuff like where there is like broken down buildings, things like that, right? And then there's also instances of social disorder. Probably should have used a different color for the definition part, so we'll go ahead and do that now. So think about the social disorder part, right? So these are going to be like the behaviors of people in areas. So in this particular case, then, right? we're looking at the behaviors, right? We historically have, combined these with the sense of like if there is open air drug use, right? If there is homelessness or spitting. So why do we do this then, right? What is the manipulation that we're trying to achieve here if we focus on this kind of stuff, right? Because really, police aren't going to do this, right? They're not going to clean up streets, they're not going to clean up trash, right? There are other city agencies that are in charge for it, right? So they're more focused on the social disorder. This could also be like drinking in public, what have you. So what is the goal of this, right? If we think that we're going to do this, right? Now, comparatively, right, we might say that this collection of behaviors, right, other than the other stuff, right, is that this is like small potatoes, right? It's not a crime to be homeless, right? But like people might consider that like loitering, right? And they might consider the loitering a crime. If we have the open air drug use, right, it's not like illegal to be an at to like having a addiction, right? But like the possession of those materials and maybe like the sale of it, right? Like that, those behaviors are ridiculous, are prohibited, right? If you're drinking in a bar, or not in a bar, right, but out on the street, it's disorderly. Or if you have all these like minor offenses, right? These are small potatoes, right? So the idea then is that like typically like in the past, right, people might ignore this kind of aspect, right? But if you think about, I think we used white for that part of our deterrence triangle, right? So we think again about our deterrence triangle, right? If we're thinking about what officers do, right? If we have severity, we have the certainty, and we have the celerity, not celery, going on here. In this particular case, right, we know that the police are supposed to have like the certainty of punishment, right? So we still want to focus on that, right? And we might communicate this through enforcement by targeting people, and we're more likely to issue tickets or sanctions or something else like that, right? But we're also, in some ways, right, manipulating the severity component as well, right? So underneath this kind of disorder policing, what the goal ends up being, right, is that we're trying to increase the perceived certainty that targeting small offenses will get punished, either through a ticket or through an arrest. We're also trying to, because maybe in the past, right, a lot of these behaviors would have been ignored or not really handled right. We might also increase the severity of punishment for those behaviors, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that an officer is going to issue a sanction every time that he sees that, right? So if I see you drinking in public, doesn't mean I have to issue a ticket, although in some cases, some departments might encourage that, right? But it might mean that I am going to intervene if I see it, might have a conversation, ask you to move along, what are you doing here, right? So there's more of this like invasive component, right? Because, I'm now disrupting behavior, right? I see something, I'm disrupting the behavior of what's going on. So, there is a change in the officer behavior because now I'm focusing. The idea behind this, right? So if I'm focusing on these little behaviors, right, is that the hope is that by sweating the small stuff, people will be less likely to do the big stuff, right? in this case, right, if you think about this from like a parenting perspective, right, we'll pick someone, uh, won't say who, but we'll call this person hypothetically mom, right? Maybe it's my mom, maybe it's not, right? Now, my mom, like as a kid, right, we kind of come on as a kid because I'm small now in this picture, right? Her goal might be, like as a kid, right, is to maybe like, have like these, use maybe like, maybe some yelling or chiding. Get it on my case, right? Get on my case, right? Be annoying because like, oh, I don't want to deal with you, mom. Right. The goal being, her goal isn't maybe she, at the end of the day, she doesn't necessarily care about these minor behaviors, right? But the goal being is that if I prevent this small behavior, right? So if I prevent these minor misbehavior stuff going on, um, then I'm going to prevent him from even thinking about doing big, major stuff. So if I say that I don't want you swearing in the house, I want you to be clean. If I, don't want you to have the underage drinking, right? You're not going to like, drive a car while you're drunk, right? Or something like that, right? If I make you think you're going to get caught, and if I just like make, if you do get caught, it's going to be life on hell for you, right? Then I'm successful, right? Because I'm preventing larger problems, right? And so if we think about this from a sort of like deterrence perspective, right? Two things that I'm working on, right, is like one, I'm trying to deter bigger crime, right? I'm also communicating that if something does happen, right, so there's going to be a general effect, general deterrent effect, because I'm communicating to the community that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. It will be targeted, it will be punished, right? And that part is really good, right? I'm also maybe trying to hope, right, that there is a restrictive deterrent effect in that I limit the misbehavior or limit the kind of misbehavior. The kind of misbehavior, the kind of crime, or the frequency of it by increasing my watchful eye. So in this way, this is like what we end up doing then. My goal is to prevent juicy crime by focusing on small stuff. So the thing is, right, is that if this is going to be effective, right, and I'm really, focusing again, we're going to incorporate, another little trade-off section. I like the trade-offs. I don't know if you guys like the trade-offs, right? I do, right? So we think about the trade-offs that happen with the strategy, right? What's going to be a good color? What do you guys think? Taking options. What do you guys think? What's going to be a good color? Oh, you like this purple? Me too. Good call. So if we think about this trade-offs that would happen here, right? One, this can be seen as being, harassing behavior, right? Because if I'm an officer or I'm a department and I'm telling police officers to focus on the small stuff, right? I am asking people to be intrusive and invasive, right? I want them to be disruptive. And that can be kind of annoying, and it can also be viewed as like the police never leave me alone. It can also create feelings of being targeted by police, right? And as we mentioned before, you're focusing on areas where there is high crime and other areas, right? These areas are populated with people who are impoverished, who are typically populated by black and brown populations, right? And so it can also, you amplify the discriminatory behavior, right? Or the perception of it, biased behavior, and you lead to this trade off on public trust. So those are probably not so good, right? We don't want that, right? As you probably have noticed, right? If we think about the Institute of Policing, right, and since it is designed to be watchful and intended to deter, right, while we like it when we feel safe, we don't necessarily like how it's typically done, right, in practice, right? Because if we use the police, right, they can issue formal sanctions, meaning that they activate the criminal justice system, they can make us go to jail, right, if we get caught by it, right? So we don't like that part, right? Because we know they also have the power to stop us, to search us, to use force, and ultimately they use their discretion to do that, right? So it doesn't feel so good when that happens, right? But again, this is part of the trade-off that happens, right? Is that if you want something to be effective, to be like stopping police and stuff like that, right? This is kind of what happens because of that. It doesn't mean it's good. But it is a trade-off that happens, right? The other part that's kind of like a misnomer, right, is that if you have this increase in people going to jail for small stuff, right, you do increase like court costs. You do have to have this increase in officers in what they're doing, right, and their deployment. You might have some people get aggressive with police. It could possibly lead to like an increase in injuries and like attacks like on the police because people are tired of being hostile, having hostile police and things like that. You could also have issues where, so there's a cost basis for this, right? But it's kind of mixed, right? Um, Evidence about its overall efficacy and its ability to prevent crime, right? So it's kind of a problem, right? Because if you're asking people to focus on certain areas, to target certain behaviors, and that part might be good, and it comes at a cost, right? And especially if you think it's going to be like sort of like mixed evidence in support of it, right? It's not really kosher, right? Because we want the things that would work and maximize our benefits, right? But have like have more appealing trade-offs, right? So when we think about disorder kind of policing, right, and while it may be useful, right, there are consequences to it, right? There's always these consequences.